Hi, and welcome to our second book club. We are so excited today for our guest, Eric McNulty, who is the Associate Director of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative. He is an amazing guy, and I'm sure you're going to learn that. And we're going to be talking about his book, You're It. So, welcome, Eric. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Donna. It's great to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background? I know you've got I read the book and it's phenomenal, and we're going to get into the book soon, but can you give us a little bit of the background and where you're coming from here?
Sure. So the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative has been around since just after 9/11. It's a joint program of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. So we're a cross-school initiative. And since 2003, we've been looking at leaders in crisis situations, trying to understand what works, what doesn't, where are the stresses, what are the decisions that are really difficult to make, and how do you get through them? So it's been very much a field research-based exercise, and then bringing it back into academia and ratifying some of the concepts through the scholarly literature. And prior to this, I was at Harrison's Publishing, a contributing editor there for a number of years, and in communications in the private sector prior to that. So this adventure in terms of crisis leadership was a new one for me, but so exciting because you get to learn a lot about people, a lot about organizations, and get to see some good people doing really, really good work, keeping our community safe and secure.
Yeah, and you've worked with leaders, and I understand that you guys do workshops, right? And you've got another one coming up in March. Tell us a little bit about the workshops and how that works.
Certainly. So we're now online, as is everybody in COVID world. And we bring people in. We've got a core practices and then an advanced course. Each of them is 8 sessions over 4 weeks. And we try and give people some of the fundamental tools you need to understand what it takes to lead through a crisis. So part of that, and you and I have a lot in common here, Donna, of how do you become grounded emotionally and cognitively so you can process what's going on, so you can manage your emotions. How do you understand the situation, what's happening, who are the stakeholders, what are their interests, how does that come into play? And then how do you build the relationships you need in order to succeed? Because none of us leads through a crisis alone. There are other people involved, some of whom are in your team. You're sort of the boss, but a lot of times it can be your board, it can be parents, it can be community members, customers, a lot of stakeholders over whom you have no control. So how do you lead through influence? And so we go through a series of very interactive sessions. There's a lot of scenario and case discussion. So we actually put people into situations and help them use the tools we provide with them to take a multidimensional perspective, better understand themselves and how they respond under stress, and then how to nurture those relationships so that you can bring together, you leverage a lot of resources and expertise to solve the problem at hand.
It's so funny because everybody right now, I feel like, we're in this time period where everybody feels like they're in crisis. We're experiencing that from every level, from K through 12, all the way up through the government. Every sector is dealing with crisis. So we've got leaders in every sector. We even have, within the household, you're a leader within your own home. So all of these lessons really apply wherever you are. And the funny thing is, you've been doing this for so long. This has been part of, and you and I have had these discussions for years. We connected years ago and have been talking about the brain science and the importance of being prepared and the importance of these lessons. And when your book came out, the timing was amazing. Because it was right before, it feels like you've had all these lessons that you've gotten together and you had it really prepared right when it was needed most. So tell us a little bit about launching right before COVID.
It is really interesting, and we can take no credit for the timing. Obviously, I don't want anyone to think we caused the COVID response, COVID outbreak to sell some books. We didn't do that, and it did feel, again, as we were doing the work and then putting the book together, that the individuals who had these experiences, be it the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the Boston Marathon bombings, in public health terms, the H1N1 outbreak, the Ebola outbreak, that these were sort of rare occurrences, interesting stories, and good to learn from. But there was a select group who would face these kind of circumstances. Now, as you mentioned, everybody needs to be prepared for this. look at just over the last couple of weeks, we've had the bumpy vaccine rollout. We've had an airliner with an engine flame out while in flight. We've had a statewide power outage due to a severe weather event. We've had, and you go back a few months, we've had obviously all the issues around school closures, the economy, wildfires. Just before COVID broke out, we were all obsessed over wildfires. Australia was on fire. The American West was having
Yeah.
unprecedented wildfires. So I think we're in a period of sustained turbulence, and that's why I think it's important for so many people to grasp these basic skills. This is not it's not a mystery, and it isn't just certain people who are born into it or who are naturally equipped. It is acquiring a set of skills and self-understanding that prepare you for these difficult circumstances.
Well, and it was great because, your book launched and in the book, you give so many strategies. It's kind of the workshop that you've been given, and you give stories of how it's applied within the field through all of those experiences that you talked about, H1N1, the Boston Marathon bombing, all of those experiences. You've worked with people who are on the ground, and we look at what were their experiences. So you give the narratives of how this applies. But I love the actual sort of, here are the tools and strategies that you can use, and they're able to be used throughout any experience. So one of them is pop doc. Talk a little bit about, well, you know what, let's start with, you talk about mindful leadership, that this meta leadership, sorry. I'm used to talking mindful leadership, but it's very similar.
It is
And
very
when
simple.
we talk about mindfulness, I think about meta, that idea of almost the bird's eye view of what's happening and being able to have that perspective. And you talk about three parts of meta leadership. Can you expand on that?
Sure, and you're right. That meta prefix is meant to prompt people to take that broader view, because one of the things that can happen in a crisis, any kind of crisis, you get in a car accident to a global public health emergency, you tend to narrow your view. Our brains are hardwired to narrow that view because it's trying to, your brain's trying to keep you alive. So if it senses a threat, it wants to go, where's that threat? Focus on that, resolve it before you move on. And if you are facing, if a car is speeding toward you, you have to jump out of the way. That's a really good instinctual response to have. But if you're actually leading and you're leading groups of people through a crisis, you've got to step back and take that broader view, as you said. You've got to take that meta view to see who are the stakeholders and what's the larger picture here, what's going on. And then our framework, our meta leadership framework, is intentionally simple. It has three dimensions. There's the person. Who are you? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Are you aware of what's happening inside your body, inside your brain, so that you can be calm and composed? Because one of the consistent things across the people we interviewed for the book, they tend to be very confident and very humble. So they're able to manage themselves very well in a crisis because they're not afraid of the situation, but they're also a bit in awe of the situation. And so that
Mhm.
balance is a good one to keep. And then it is the second dimension is the situation. What's happening? What's the context in which you're trying to lead? And it is very difficult, or very different, excuse me, if you've got, let's say, a public health outbreak like we have now, versus an active shooter, versus a sexual harassment allegation, versus just every day when things are relatively normal, and the biggest crisis is somebody fell down the stairs, or there was a fender bender outside the front office. Those are different contingencies, and so you have to be able to look at the context and say, what's needed of me now? How do I need to show up? What needs to be done? And then the third dimension is connectivity. So it's building those relationships and understanding how the system works. And that's up and down within your organization, but also across and beyond. So the different other departments and functions within your organization besides your own, and then beyond to those external stakeholders. So I work at a university, and we have internally, we've got faculty and we've got staff, we've got students, and then we've got, and within the university, of course, and universities are famous for this, the different parts not always working well together. We try hard, but there's always a bit of friction. It's true of any large organization. But then those external stakeholders, it's the parents, it's the other schools to which we may be, transferring students in and out. It's the communities in which we operate. You've got to understand what's in that system, what's driving it, and where are the leverage points so you can try and resolve the situation to get the best possible outcome for the greatest number of people. Now you mentioned PopDoc. You went to probably our most complex tool. So as much as the framework is intentionally simple, with PopDoc, and this is a variation of something called the OODA loop. So if any of our listeners today were in the Air Force or knew people in the Air Force, one of the ways they trained fighter pilots is something called the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, and act. And it's a cycle you go through. And if you can go through that more quickly than your opposing pilot, you're more likely to win the dogfight. So know what's going on, know what it means, make a decision, take action. And in the confines of the cockpit of a fighter aircraft, that's a great model. When you're leading, however, you're in a more complex situation. So we actually stepped back, inspired by the OODA loop, and talked to some neuroscientists and said, what are the different cognitive functions we go through when we're optimally processing information and taking action in a situation like this? And that was what became the PopDoc loop. The P is for perceive. You want to open your aperture wide and bring information in so you can get data in. Because again, we tend to close off when things are starting to go wrong and filter too early. So you want to open up and be able to bring information in, gather data. And then the O is for orient. Look for patterns. What does that data mean? What's relevant? What's irrelevant? We as humans are natural pattern forming machines or pattern recognition machines,
Mm-hmm.
but we're also good at recognizing false patterns. So you want to be sort of intentional and conscious about figuring out what's relevant, what's not, where are the patterns. Because once you see patterns, patterns tend to repeat, which takes you to the second P, which is predict. And as a leader, you want to be thinking ahead, not just what's happening right now, but what's going to happen next. What is my organization going to need, not just today, but next week, next month, next year, so you can begin to get people ready for it. So you can make some predictions based on the patterns. Hopefully you have the time to put some probabilities against them and do some pressure testing around the predictions. Once you're predicting what's going to happen next, this is all around a figure eight Mobius loop, I should say, a figure eight, because we're the pop part is sort of the thinking. Then you cross over now with the D, which is decide. If you're leading, you've got to make a decision. You've got to actually be able to propel
Yeah.
things forward. So you can't just think about it forever. You got to do something. So you make the decisions based on your predictions. The O now on this action side is for operationalize. Be thinking through what is it going to take to carry out my decisions? What are the resources that we're going to need? Who are the people involved? Do they have the authority, or do they have the what they need in order to carry this out? Because nothing is worse than making a decision and then finding out you can't get there. Look at the vaccine rollout right now. People say, okay, we're going to vaccinate, but if they don't have enough doses, they can't vaccinate. If we're short
Right.
of nurses and others who are trained to give the vaccinations, we can't do it. So you need those operational considerations to really ground you up, in taking action. And the C is for communicate. People need to know what's happening, the bigger picture, as well as what is their role in it. What are you expecting of them? What do you want them to do? And then you go back around to the first side. You go back and perceive again to say, okay, we made some decisions, took some action. Did it have the intended consequences or not? Did it do what we thought it was going to do or not? And you can then make adjustments. So again, this figure eight, you think going around perceive, orient, predict, that's the thinking side. Then you cross over to the other side of that eight, decide, operationalize, communicate, and you go back again. And that loop, again, we didn't make it up conceptually. We talked to the neuroscientists and said, what are the cognitive processes that are going on? And by having the model, it can remind you that you actually need to go through them and go through them sequentially. Now, I've seen people go through it in milliseconds because,
Mm-hmm.
again, it's the way if our brain's working well, it's what we do. I've also seen people use it as an organizing framework for a team meeting. You're doing crisis management, you've got your folks together. Okay, what do we think we know? What's the data out there? What does it mean? And you go through that, and it can be a good way to keep a team on track and moving forward productively. So I hope that wasn't too confusing. But PopDoc is one of those ones I know when they first hear it, it's like, that sounds kind of wonky. But then when you go to use it, because it's built around your natural processes, it's pretty easy to get. And then once you get it, it's like, oh, this is really good. I like having this flow. I like having this rhythm, and I like having the reminders of what I need to do to make sure we stay on track and keep moving forward.
I think it's a great process, and it does work with the way our brains work. And I know you and I both are kind of brain geeks. We like to know the neuroscience and understand how our brains work. Um, One of the things from a leadership perspective, in terms of that, one of the things that I think is the area that leaders tend to trip up the most is the communication piece. I think it's the one that I have found people have the most difficulty with. And I think it's the thing that is such a critical part of the way everybody else's brains work. Because when we know what's happening, when we understand what's happening and we understand why, we're much less likely to go into that crisis mode, into, what I call grasshopper mode, what you
Mhm.
call, that limbic response. That when we go to the basement thinking, if
Right.
we don't have that predictability. And I think that area of communication is so critical. And sometimes that's the piece that gets left out. People just move on to the back to the P before they get the C communicated effectively. And I think that that's the area that a lot of leaders have difficulty, because people do go to the basement.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that, again, when what you can do as a leader is begin to build islands of certainty amidst the chaos. Having a
Yes.
structured process like PopDoc is one way to do that. Being transparent with your information. Here are the decisions we're making, and here's why. Gives people some certainty to hold on to, and that allows them to deal with the uncertainty and the ambiguity of the situation. And you're right. To me, one of the biggest jobs for a leader is to create clarity. Clarity
Mhm.
about where we are, where we're going, what's your role, what can you expect of me, what can I expect of you. If you can create clarity in those areas, people can then they, they can act independently, but they'll be acting independently, moving in the direction you want them to go. You actually free up a
Yes.
lot of capacity and a lot of energy in the system when you create that clarity. And of course, in a crisis, I always liken it to riding in the back of a Jeep on a safari. If you've got an old-fashioned camera, not your camera phone, but the old-fashioned camera, you're adjusting the lens and you're trying to take a photograph when you're bumping up and down and the Jeep is moving, you're always having to adjust to keep things in focus. It's the same thing of leading through crisis. You got to keep adjusting that lens for people so they understand what you know, what you don't know, what you're doing about it, and what you expect them to do about it. And that can
Right.
really say it calms down that limbic system because people have something to hang on to. And that gives them an anchor. And then from there, they calm down and it's possible to get a lot more productive action.
Well, and that comes back to the social threats and rewards to the brain. And one of the biggest threats is that sense of control. Do we have a sense that things are in control? Do we know we have a leader that we can trust to be honest with us? And even if it's bad news, if it's delivered in a way that we're going to be honest, we're going to do our best to let you know what's happening, it's much better for the brain than it is if we don't know, because our brains tend to paint the worst picture, right?
Right, they do. Right, right. You're right. The brain's primary job is keeping you alive, and so
Right.
it's looking for risk and reward, but particularly risk. And that's why, and it's good. That's why I've always admired your work is giving people a language around this they can understand and giving them the tools to be able to understand what's happening inside this very complicated mechanism we carry between our ears. Really helps them. When you know what's going on, you can better manage it and better respond to it in a productive way. And this is again why communication is so important, why presence is so important. Sometimes
Hmm.
just being there physically, showing up, get to okay, I can count on this person because she showed up. And
Right.
people can handle the truth, despite what Jack Nicholson said way back when. People can handle the truth, and it's better you give them the hard truth, and they know they can trust you and you're being transparent, than you hide something or try and sugarcoat it. You can always give them bad news and say, and you know what? We will get through this. I'm
Right.
confident we'll get through it. And I'm confident this team can get us through it. I'm confident we can work together and get through this. So you can still pull people up aspirationally and pull them together. But if you don't communicate well, if you don't give them the truth and they find it out elsewhere, that now raises your risk profile way back up. We'll say,
Yeah.
can I trust this person or not? And now you're back into the brain having that limbic response that is not good for anybody.
Yeah. It's critical, and everybody is in that situation right now. How can we build trust with our constituents, whoever it is, whether it's, whether you're in your home, whether you're at schools, whether you're, let's be predictable, let's let people know what's happening, how can we help them through this? um, I love, I'll tell you kind of my favorite parts of the book. I absolutely loved your exercise about the arm wrestling. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's such an important lesson for human nature and what we tend to do and how we can change that way of thinking.
Okay, so we're going to do a modified version of the exercise right here, and we'll see if people can play along as they're watching this. So those of you who are listening, I want you to get into an arm wrestling position and pretend you've got somebody there with whom you're going to get into this arm wrestling position. Your job in the next 30 seconds is to get the back of that other person's hand down to the table as many times as possible. Ready? Get set. Now tell me the first word that came into your mind. Was it competition or cooperation? Now, when we do this in person, we see the people who are arm wrestling position, they think competition. And so they're up there and they're ready to fight as hard as they can. And the two people are sort of going back and forth unless one of them is really strong and then they'll dominate. But there are also people who heard the second part of the instructions, which was to get the other person's back of their hand down on the table as many times as possible in the 30 seconds. And so they start going like this. And they think cooperation, because if you're actually waving back and forth, we can each get a win out of this. When we're fighting, we're competing, one of us may get one or two. Maybe if I'm really strong again, I may just start hammering you and it won't be very fun. You'll be pulling your hand away and not wanting to participate anymore. Those who figure out, again, we say get in an arm wrestling position, but that's because of that framing, it triggers something in your mind. Again, we go right to that pattern recognition really fast. Arm wrestling position, okay, I'm ready to fight. What we try and get people to, first of all, understand is it's important how you frame every interaction. So are you setting people up to fix or to fight? And that can be when you come into the conference room, is your team on one side, the other team on the other side, so you're faced against each other like opponents, or do you mix around the table? There are times when you can get people to, in a less formal setting, or begin to set something up where you're initially working together, trying to trigger that cooperative response. If I had just said, we're going to play a game, I want you to get the hand of the other person down as many times as possible, and hadn't mentioned arm wrestling, more people would tend to go toward cooperation. So when we send out these signals, be they written, verbal, nonverbal, these cues will trigger whether people go into that competitive or that cooperative stance. And in a crisis, you typically want them fighting against the problem. You want people working well together. And so by being open and transparent, creating that safe environment, creating a feeling of solidarity among the stakeholders, you can get them to cooperate with each other. But it's very much a behavioral response, and you've got to be very conscious as a leader of which triggers you activate, and what you perceive as what you portray as the enemy, because folks will go fight against that enemy. And if it's internal fighting, that's not going to be good. It's not going to get you where you want to go. You've got to get people together. So we come back to that arm wrestling exercise. We do one of our workshops. We come back to that over and over again, and looking at, because it's a lesson that really endures. It's a simple exercise. You actually can find videos of it online. It's really, it's important to understand where those triggers are in our brain, which levers we're pulling, and being very intentional about it.
It's powerful because it's a reframing.
Yes.
It's, I'm sure that so many people who are in the workshops get this moment like, oh, what was I thinking? How could I not have seen this? And yet it's so critical, because in that moment of crisis, we may not see things. So to begin to understand how we can to consciously reframe it as, who are the supports, who are people that we can go to, how can we work together on this? And I think that's so critical.
And you could do this in really simple ways. So if, let's say you're getting together, let's say I'm a school administrator and parents are coming in, and we're thinking we might have a contentious meeting now because we're trying to figure out how to open the schools. When people come in, you got the materials for the evening sitting on a table. Say, can you help me arrange? Obviously, we can't be together physically right now, but if you could be together physically, can we work together to pass these out and get them arranged? And people engage in a cooperative activity. All of a sudden, it activates that cooperative response. We're now in a cooperative environment, so it actually primes people to collaborate around the issues they're going to talk about that evening. And so it's so important, because we often do things and we don't realize what we're doing when we set up these confrontations.
Yeah, I think about any point of similarity. any way that we can bring points of similarity that works with the brain. And I often refer to, there was an experiment where they had people negotiating a deal, and they either had them eating the same type of snack or different snacks while they were negotiating the deal. Either, one side was eating brownies and the other side was eating pretzels, or they were both sides were eating pretzels. People who were eating the same snack were able to negotiate the deal much faster and came out much happier with what they negotiated than people who had different snacks. It's amazing that subconscious, how can we set up the situation for success, and how, as leading in crisis, calming that, getting people out of the basement, getting them out of that grasshopper mode, getting them out of that limbic system of the brain can really change the outcome and how we can work together.
And now everyone has an excuse to bring brownies to every meeting. It's the best thing ever.
It's perfect. We
It's
love
perfect.
eating.
But you're right.
Eating.
The point you make is so important, because again, there are these, most of our cognitive activity happens at a subconscious level. We aren't fully aware of what the brain's doing, and so the brain is picking up on these little signals, and it affects how we behave. And so something as simple as serving the same snacks, creating that sharing opportunity, how people sit, all those things affect how we come into a situation and how ultimately we behave, even if we don't realize why we're doing it.
Yeah, it is amazing when you begin to understand how we can change the way that we interact. Um, and the last thing that I wanted to point out from the book, because you give so many great resources, so many great examples, so many great stories. I loved hearing about the leadership stories that different people had. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight was the walk in the woods. And I wish that everybody could do it as a walk in the woods, but the idea of coming together and negotiating. And again, PopDoc, just as PopDoc is a strategy for individuals as they're leading and to go through, or groups, but to go through together. When you're negotiating, we talked about the idea of similarity, but then also having that routine, having that system in place of the walk in the woods. So can you elaborate on that? And then we
Certainly. So the walk in the woods is a method for interest-based negotiation. And anybody who's read Getting to Yes or any of the books like that, those are all about interest-based negotiation. And we developed the walk because not everybody gets to go to a negotiation seminar at Harvard Law School or somewhere else. But we're all negotiating every day. Every interaction we have with another human being where there's an intended outcome, be it your kids, your spouse, your administrative assistant, your boss, those are all negotiations. So how do you learn to negotiate better? And with the 4 steps of the walk are meant to be, again, an intentionally simplified model to make it easy to remember and easy to use. And so the walk is, again, it's meant to be a detour. It comes out of a famous story in negotiation, which I won't go into in depth, but it was a Soviet and a US delegation negotiating over nuclear arms were at a real impasse. And so they took a break. They were at a conference center in Switzerland, and the lead Soviet negotiator and lead US negotiator wound up meeting up outside and went for a walk on the grounds, which were wooded. So it was a walk, literally was a walk in the woods. And as they began to walk, they left the tensions of the negotiations behind them, where they were really deadlocked. And they started talking, and it turned out that they were both happy to be in this beautiful setting. They were both proud to represent their countries. They started talking about their families and their grandkids and how they wanted a better world for them. And over the course of that walk, they decided they discovered they actually had a lot in common. And then when they went back into the room, the whole tenor of the negotiation changed, and they actually were able to come to an agreement that they hadn't been able to come to before. And so we modeled this 4-step process on that as a detour away from the typical negotiation of, here's the problem, let's fight over the solution. Mine's better than yours, I'm right, you're wrong. But to take a detour to find out where's the common ground. And so the first step in the walk is called self-interests, where each party says what their interests are. Why are you here? What do you want to get out of this? What's important to you? And that process of being able to put your interests out is very, very important. It creates a more safe and secure environment, and actually being heard. Here's the important part: active listening. The other party, rather than being just waiting to get their stuff out and start battling, It slows things down so you actually listen to what the other party is interested in, because you're going to get a chance to put yours out there too. This is a part of level setting here. When you get the self-interest out there, you then go to the enlarged interest, and you look at where do people agree and where do they disagree. And spoiler alert, my colleagues and I have been doing this for 20 years. People always agree upon more than they disagree upon. Always. It can take a bit of digging sometimes, but you wouldn't be at the table if you didn't agree on things. And often it's underlying values. Often it's desire to end the conflict. It can be that you both want to get to a better place in the future, but you can always find things you agree upon. Again, it takes a little bit of work sometimes, but every time we have done this, we have found a longer list of agreements than disagreements. What that signals to people when they actually see it, and it's important to write these down on a whiteboard or a flip chart, whatever you have. When people see that long list of agreements and that shorter list of disagreements, it now again reframes it. Those disagreements look a lot more solvable because they're smaller than the agreements, which then takes you to the third step, the enlightened interests. This is where you begin to brainstorm, work together to say, how can we creatively overcome these disagreements? You won't overcome them all. You don't always do that. But because you've now seen that you agree on a lot, you've got a basis for collaborating, getting creative. It's a no commitment zone, so you can throw out whatever crazy ideas you want to. And you will come to some that work, some that won't work, some that may need a little massaging to be able to work. But you'll be able to come to some things to solve part of the problem, which then brings you to the fourth step, which are the aligned interests. These are the things we agree upon and we're going to carry forward as our agreement. And I say we've seen this in small interpersonal negotiations with a couple of people. We've done it with mergers between big health systems. It's a process that you can deploy at many scales, but because it's structured and it's simple, you can explain it to people. Here are the 4 steps we're going to go through. Or if it's depending on your situation, you may not just use it as your own internal negotiation guide, but it triggers you first to listen, to make sure you are listened to. Find those points of agreement. That's the common ground on which you're going to build your solution, that you actually agree on things. Get creative, use your imagination to think of new ways you may be able to solve the problem, and then come to something you can agree upon. And these are aligned interests. I think of like railroad tracks. Railroad tracks don't overlap, but they run side by side. So we each can get our win in it. We may not get the same things out of the deal, but we're both happy enough with it that we can both ride that train out to the final solution. And again, it's one of these. We try to do this over and over in the book and in our workshops as well. Is give people tools that are easy to use. There's a lot of work that goes into them and building them and a lot of scholarship behind them, but the final product we try and give to people, it has to be easy to use and pragmatic, because otherwise it won't be used. You don't need the 400 pages of theory of interest-based negotiation unless you're a scholar. You need to have something you can use in a practical setting, and that's what we've tried to do.
I think you've done a fantastic job. And so I hear you have the paperback is just coming out with a new additional chapter about
This
COVID.
Yeah, this is the paperback. It's not in stores yet. It'll be in stores in mid-March, but I just got my advanced copies, so you're among the first to see them. And it's updated with some new information. We have a new chapter on leading through COVID, which is really a story about leading with influence over authority. It revolves a lot around a gentleman named Pete Gaynor, whose name you might have heard over the last few months. He was the head of FEMA, and FEMA was put in charge of the response of getting PPE, of getting people taken care of at a national level. And this is something FEMA's never been asked to do before. FEMA, up until this point, was never involved in public health emergencies. And in this case, they wanted an agency that knew how to get things done, that knew logistics, could roll things out. And so Pete Gaynor, who wasn't that long in the job, was handed this task of, go do it, go fix it. Um, in terms of the law, actually, FEMA didn't have a lot of jurisdictional authority. So a lot of what Pete had to do, and he's a tremendous story. He's a former Marine. He's from Rhode Island. Very calm guy, very self-effacing guy. Back to that sort of confident but humble that I talked about earlier. I think what Jim Collins would call level 5 leaders. Um, and it's a story of how he he had to work up to the president, who was, we know, President Trump was not the easiest person to lead up to. Even with people who was politically aligned with him, he's not the easiest boss to lead up to. And then down to an agency that was doing something for the first time, and then across to governors and other state level officials who didn't necessarily have the best opinion of the federal government all the time. And so it's really, I think, an interesting story of how he used this thinking and these tools to navigate this really difficult landscape. And We just had a handoff, and so we've got a new set of folks in place now, but they laid a really good foundation and did it in it's a very apolitical story, so we don't take sides in the politics at all, which is the career folks we work with in the government are largely apolitical. But it goes to show you how much you can get done when you understand influence, when you understand interpersonal behavior, and how you get people to buy into what you want to do, how you communicate well, and improve a situation. It was far from perfect what they did, but they improved it greatly over what it was before FEMA got involved. So we hope people find inspiration in that chapter as well.
That's fantastic. And what you're doing, both at the national level where you're helping to do these workshops where you're helping people who are really actively involved in these crises, and preparing them to do so is phenomenal. But then to take it and make it accessible to anyone, in such an easy and accessible way, is fantastic. I really enjoyed the book and
Good.
look forward to hearing other people's opinion and having people read it. We're so excited to get it out there.
Well, thank you. And I could just share two other resources for people. I want you to read the book, love the book. If we run into each other at an airport someday, I'll happily sign it for you. But we also have quite a number of videos on YouTube. If you search on Harvard NPLI around these tools, you'll see some other examples as other faculty members explaining them. And then on our website, which is npli.sph.harvard.edu, we have scholarly articles. We've got case histories of certain events. We've got a lot of resources there you can find, which are available to the public. So npli.sph.harvard.edu. You'll find lots of things there. So it's part of our educational mission. But thank you so much for the opportunity to come talk about the book.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. It's always great to talk to you.
Donna, my pleasure. Thank you so much.